The cop tries to embarrass a black woman without realizing she is a decorated intelligence officer in the military. As soon as Officer Derek Lawson pulled over the shiny black SUV, tension crackled in the night air. He could hardly make out the driver. The only thing he could see was her outline in the light of a streetlight. The car's excessive ostentation and smooth design prompted his suspicions. He practiced his standard lines, which he believed would put her in her place in his mind as he drew near. He had no idea that this driver was anything but ordinary. Called to Camille Turner, a decorated United States soldier, was standing before me. Army intelligence officer, educated to identify potential dangers and neutralize them before they materialize. There had never been an easy time in Camille Turner's life. She had a restless personality even before she enlisted in the Army. From an early age, she had learned in her small town of Fayetteville, North Carolina, that there weren't always opportunities for girls who looked like her to get a second chance at life. She was determined to overcome any obstacle that stood in her way, and her eyes were burning with determination. A desire to serve her country motivated her to leave home at the age of 18 and attend the University of Texas. Her dad's military career came to an end due to a knee injury. He was a sergeant. He instilled in her the values of patriotism and self-control, and he taught her to fight for justice regardless of the cost to herself. Every piece of advice that Camille received, she incorporated into her own identity, and she kept going. Camille joined the U.S. military right after finishing her bachelor's degree in political science, Army, and headed straight into military intelligence. After devoting herself to cryptologic linguistics for some time, she branched out into counterintelligence and trained relentlessly. She exuded an air of self-control, intelligence, and dogged persistence that the officers noticed. Even though there was occasional bigotry within the service, her track record was more convincing than anyone could have hoped. She was promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel not long ago after receiving numerous commendations and promotions. Still, Camille had mastered the art of stealth in civilian life. Despite her extensive training and numerous accolades, there was no need, in her opinion, to brag about her position and accomplishments to complete strangers, particularly if doing so would cast a shadow over the true cause of her success. Neither favoritism nor delusions were in her desire. It was an issue of personal pride for her, but she was proud of herself. Having recently returned to the America from a brief deployment, Camille was making her way to her hometown in North Carolina on a brisk autumn evening in order to surprise her father for his impending birthday. She maintained her license and registration in a tidy folder and drove a shiny black SUV, which she had gotten as an early reward for her most recent promotion. The roads were mostly deserted. It was late, and she was filled with that homecoming feeling. The vintage silver ring that had been a keepsake from her initial tour abroad shimmered in the light of the passing street lamps. Gently tapping on the wheel, she hummed along to a classic R&B station. Then she looked in her rearview mirror and saw flashing red and blue lights. Her heart pounded with a chilly surge of adrenaline. She hadn't been erratic with her lane changes or speeding. Why had they stopped her? Remain composed, she told herself. She was no stranger to combat zones. She had previously thwarted insurgents who had attempted to steal vital intelligence. She reassured herself that this was just a regular traffic stop. However, she couldn't shake the nagging thought that people who resembled her sometimes had their traffic stops abruptly ended. Still, Camille pulled over onto the narrow shoulder. She pressed her hands together in a lap as she pressed the car's park button and silenced her music. Her heart thumped in her ears, but her expression remained neutral. She was used to controlling her nerves under pressure. Outside her window, the policeman's silhouette was illuminated by the swirling red and blue haze of the patrol car's lights. He seemed to stand there for a moment, as though sizing her up through the tinted glass. Camille rolled down her window, her driver's license and registration already in hand. Her life had always been extraordinary in some ways, but to outside eyes she was just another driver on a lonely stretch of road. For Camille, that was exactly how she liked it. until she discovered that anonymity could also be a weapon used against her. Officer Derek Lawson prided himself on his instincts. In the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office, he believed he was the toughest, the most diligent, and the most deserving of respect. In his eyes, he had a duty to keep the peace. Yet his methods drew questions from colleagues and townspeople alike, who noticed he favored heavier enforcement against certain groups of people. He chalked it up to criminal statistics, never acknowledging his bias as something deeper and far uglier. Lawson's father had been a state trooper, and his grandfather too. His entire family lineage dripped with the authority of a badge. Growing up, Lawson was taught that wearing the uniform placed him in a special position of power. For him, this power was more than just a responsibility. It was a privilege that gave him license to treat people however he deemed fit. Tonight, as he cruised the long stretch of highway just outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, his eyes landed on the black SUV that Camille was driving. Something about the expensive rims and the tinted windows set off Lawson's prejudice. In his mind, it was probably another punk from the city, up to no good in his county. He switched on the sirens and watched with grim satisfaction as the SUV slowed and pulled to the side. Before stepping out, he radioed in. "Pulling over a suspicious vehicle," he said, "possibly stolen. Will advise once I have a read." There had been no indication that Camille's automobile was stolen. Lawson hadn't even run the plates yet, but he was playing a hunch motivated by ignorance and intolerance. As Lawson neared the driver's side, he tried to fix his face into an authoritarian scowl. The driver's window rolled down. With a flick of his flashlight, he saw Camille's face. She was a black woman, mid-30s, well-groomed but obviously exhausted, following a long travel. Lawson felt a strange wave of annoyance. Camille offered a modest nod. "Good evening, officer." Her voice was calm, practiced. She'd dealt with all kinds of authority types, from generals to commanding officers, and had found that a courteous tone frequently reduced tension. "Driver's license and registration." Lawson barked, thrusting his flashlight into her eyes. He wanted her off balance. Still calm, she gave them over. "Here you are, sir." Lawson grabbed them without a word and strolled back to his patrol cruiser. He placed the documents into his laptop's card reader, not stopping to read the name properly. If he had, he could have spotted the little detail that her driver's license photo was taken on a military base, or at least recognized the significance of the letters LTC on her registration. Though it wasn't always typical for a personal vehicle, several states allowed military rank names on certain paperwork. Lawson's system took time to process the license and registration. Camille's record was, of course, squeaky clean, no violations other than a couple of minor speeding tickets from a decade ago. Lawson massaged his chin. That wasn't enough to satisfy him. He decided he would interrogate her about the vehicle's ownership. But before returning to the SUV, Lawson did a mental inventory of all the ways he could exacerbate the situation. He felt a peculiar desire to establish his authority, to show that in this county he was in charge. When Lawson got back, he didn't pass the papers over immediately. Instead, he shined the beam directly at Camille's face again. "What are you doing driving this SUV out here at this hour?" Camille blinked against the shaft of light. "I'm on my way to my hometown to visit family. It's late, so the road's a bit vacant, but I'm not speeding." Lawson ignored her measured tone. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle for me?" She gazed at him, analyzing his body language. Camille had seen animosity in distant nations during intelligence missions, and she understood the undertone of tension in Lawson's posture. Technically, she might refuse unless he had probable cause. She also knew how easily such refusals turned hazardous in confrontations with officers like him. With a deep breath, she nodded. "All okay, officer." She opened the door and stepped onto the gravel shoulder. The night air was colder than she expected. Her boots crunched on the loose stones. Lawson stood at an angle, his hand close to his holstered revolver. "Hands where I can see them," Lawson snapped. Camille complied, elevating her hand slightly as she turned to face him. The irony of it all struck her. She had spent her life defending the freedoms of Americans, including the uniform this officer wore, and yet she stood here, hands high, being treated like a criminal. Lawson's eyes roved over her fast. "Is this your car?" Camille nodded. "Yes, sir." "The registration is in my name." Lawson peered at the papers in his palm, finally reading them correctly. "Camille Turner," he read out loud. "This claims you're a lieutenant colonel?" He scowled at the word. "What are you in the Army?" She met his gaze. "Yes, sir." "He's Army military intelligence." He let out a frigid laugh. "Yeah, certainly you are. Got a uniform on you?" There was a firm dismissal as she waved her hand. "On my day off, I will be celebrating my father's birthday at his house. My uniform is not on." Lawson advanced toward them. The natural inclination to withdraw was repressed by Camille. Resisting an aggressive person's advances constituted a red flag in her training. Her posture was unthreatening yet unwavering. He addressed her as if she were a suspect and demanded that she turn around. "I'll be checking you for weapons." Flew her eyes. "Why do you think I might be dangerous or armed?" Asking in a composed manner, she inquired. Lawson furrowed his brow. Even though it wasn't typical for an unjustified traffic stop, he dismissed it as regular procedure. After giving it some thought, Camille decided against pushing back or seeking a supervisor, because she could tell by the stress in Lawson's voice that doing either would make the situation worse. Grinning from ear to ear, she whirled around to let him pat her. His touch was harsh, and she could feel her wrath building up inside. Terrorists, opposing soldiers, and foreign spies were all people she had to deal with. But I felt worse about this. "I thought this place would be my home, okay?" Lawson responded. "Where can I see your hands? Keep them out in the open. Be still until I tell you to." Camille let out a long breath. The situation was rapidly turning from a routine traffic stop into something much darker. This cop clearly lacked the necessary training to deal with high-pressure circumstances and had no clue who he was dealing with. I saw 1,000 plans dancing behind Camille's serene eyes. How far Lawson planned to take this, and what she would do if he went too far, were questions she had. She focused on her strengths for the time being. She watched. While collecting data, she committed Lawson's nameplate to memory, taking note of his slightly trembling left hand, his boots' scuffed toes, and the way his radio crackled with static from dispatch. She took note of the wind's direction, the lights of the closest petrol station a mile away, and the realization that they would be completely alone if Lawson did something genuinely insane. She knew the drama was just beginning to unfold, and that it would continue for quite some time. While conducting what he claimed to be an exhaustive inquiry, Officer Lawson made Camille stand by her car for about 15 minutes. He illegally searched the entire SUV, opening every trunk and going through her possessions. He should have gotten Camille's permission or probable cause to search her car, but instead he insisted she stay quiet and motionless. Camille knew better. Differing feelings swirled in her head. She wanted to stand up and demand her rights, but she was also aware of how fast things could go worse, particularly if the officer harbored any resentment. Lawson might use anything she found, no matter how innocuous, as justification to put her in jail. At last, Lawson closed the final container. With his arrogant grin contorted, he made his way back to Camille's position. "Are you going to explain to me why your trunk is filled to the brim with gear?" Along with her personal belongings, extra clothing, and a handful of field manuals, Camille carried a typical Army duffel bag. Additionally, she possessed a vintage tactical vest that was not quite the norm but held sentimental importance. "I'm in the military," she said again. "I recently returned from a trip abroad. Those are the things that belong to me." A little giggle sent tremors through Lawson's body. "And I happen to be the President of the USA." A tight jaw tightened by Camille. "My service record is valid, officer. You only need to run my identity properly. I have not disobeyed any laws." I would be grateful for the chance to resume my travels and for the return of my documents." He seemed taken aback by her poise, but he was still hesitant to give an inch. He stared at her for what felt like an eternity. With a swift motion, he pissed on the gravel. He ordered them to wait in this area before returning to his patrol cruiser. She breathed deeply, releasing her tension by allowing her stiff posture to relax slightly. This situation felt very personal, despite her extensive training and experience in actual warfare. It felt so unwelcoming at times, even though this was her home nation. The time passed. The vast expanse of the night sky, dotted with faraway stars, extended along the roadside. For Camille, the feeling of being alone was heavy. Everyone was staring at her. From the patrol car, Lawson watched intently as the radio crackled and mumbled half-heard words, creating an incomprehensible discussion with dispatch. She had left her phone on the driver's seat of the SUV before getting out, so it was still inside. She considered recording the encounter, but was afraid Lawson might get even more agitated if she moved too quickly for the phone. At some point, Lawson got out of his cruiser once more. He used excessive force this time to slam the car door behind him. He approached with an air of menace, waving her paperwork in her face. "It appears that your license is valid," he stated. "I suppose you're good to go now that the registration is valid?" He still wasn't pleased about it, and his voice betrayed his dissatisfaction. He hadn't found any grounds to warrant longer detainment. A mix of relief and intense rage that this nightmare had occurred washed over Camille as she felt it begin to blossom in her chest. She retrieved her registration and license by reaching out. Just as she was about to seize them, Lawson pulled them back, as if relishing in the power she was exerting over her mind. He tossed them into the gravel where she was standing. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she picked them up. She wished she could make this man pay for his actions by demanding an apology. Lawson retreated a step, attempting to tower over her the second she loosened her jaw. "Let's not have any trouble now," he replied, his smug smile returning. "A roadside collision of any type would be unacceptable to us. Any conflict in this area has the potential to quickly escalate, according to Camille's training. The most prudent course of action would be to record his activities and inform the proper authorities." In the end, she bent down to pick up the papers, swallowing her dignity in the process. Lawson pretended to be courteous as he wished the other person good night. "You should not drive about like a drug runner the next time." Coldness gripped Camille, the words hurting in her mouth. She looked at him but said nothing. She retreated to her SUV, climbed in and shut the door behind her instead. With hands that hadn't shaken in years, she turned the key to start the engine. As she drew away from the shoulder, Lawson stayed in his police car, the nighttime lights dancing between red and blue. In her rearview mirror, Camille observed him until he was barely visible as a dot vanishing behind her. Racism and the misuse of power were not new to her. She was enraged because it was done so shamelessly. She controlled her temper by telling herself that there were established procedures for dealing with inappropriate behavior. Maybe she would bring it up with her dad. He could give her some advice or put her in touch with someone in the local sheriff's office who could be of assistance. She was deeply affected by the occurrence. That whirlwind of rage, hurt, and bewilderment persisted even as she got back on the freeway. After hearing his vicious accusations that she resembled a criminal, she began to wonder how many other defenseless individuals had been bullied by him. This, Camille was adamant, would not be the last. On foreign soil, she had conducted clandestine missions. Threats to national security may be disproven by the evidence she had gathered. She possessed all the necessary qualifications to independently gather evidence against Officer Lawson. It was just the beginning of their confrontation. She didn't realize it then. People were brought back together by fate in ways no one could have predicted, and the conditions were far more explosive than anyone had anticipated. It was still dark when Camille drove up to her dad's house. A porch light illuminated the modest suburban house, and she beheld a silhouette whiz past the front window. She pulled into the driveway and put on an exhausted smile to win over her anxious father, who was standing at the door in his old robe. Her father immediately noticed the stress in her look as soon as she stepped inside and ran his eyes over her face. "Missy, are you all right?" His voice was hardly audible as he inquired, feeling a bit anxious because it's late. While embracing him, Camille fabricated a smile. "I'm okay, Dad. I had a little trouble with the—" He led her into the living room. Camille detected a subtle aroma of coffee brewing in the background, which she interpreted as her father's lingering presence as he sipped from an antique cup that commemorated his time as the Marine's best dad. As they took a seat, Camille detailed the ordeal, including the humiliating stop, the intimidation by Officer Lawson, the search of her car, and the vile accusation. As he listened, her father, Robert Turner, a retired sergeant, kept his mouth shut and his enraged eyes wide. He trailed off before he could finish. He inhaled deeply and tightened his grip on his hands. "Truths remain constant. It's incredible that you've put your life on the line abroad. You continue to be treated in this manner despite having served your nation honorably." Camille put her hands on her knees and moaned. "You're not alone, Dad. People of our ethnicity are disproportionately victims of this form of violence, but it occurs frequently overall." Robert swallowed his wrath and nodded. "Recall that you mentioned Lawson as the name of the officer?" "Officer Derek Lawson. His nameplate said that," Camille said. Tears escaped Robert's eyes. "Tomorrow morning, I will be making some phone calls. A formal complaint can be lodged. Just in case we can hire an attorney." Camille ran her fingers through her short, well-cut hair. "Personally, I've never been a vindictive person. Listen, Dad, this wasn't your average traffic stop." His eyes betrayed his animosity. Her dad clenched his jaw. "It is best described as hate. Hey, you're only passing through, aren't you? We can advocate for a formal inquiry. Your record, rank, and service honors will all be publicized by us. Even if the cop in question attempts to downplay the incident, we will expose their true colors." Camille, whose fatigue was showing, leaned back against the sofa. "My dad, I am grateful. Perhaps you have a point. If we disregard this, he will continue to do it." "Right," Robert remarked. "It is time for you to relax. My birthday will be celebrated appropriately, but let's take care of this first. Who will challenge him and other corrupt police officers if we do not?" The edges of Camille's mouth curved into a tiny smile. She bent down to give her dad a squeeze. "Thank you, Dad. I will take a break. However, we will begin making calls first thing tomorrow." That is just what she did. To remove the dirt and grime from the night's travel, she got up early, showered, and then sat down with her father at the kitchen table. A representative from the regional VA office was already on the phone with him, and he was speaking quietly. He raised a finger to show his recognition of Camille as soon as he spotted her. Says Robert, speaking on his phone. "She holds the rank of lieutenant colonel, that is true." "I see your point. We must formally lodge a grievance. Of course we will do it." Turning to Camille, he ended the call. "I will be contacted by a legal advisor who deals with concerns related to civil rights. While we wait, we can go straight to the police and lodge a report." "Yes," Camille said with a nod. "Let's do it." The Cumberland County Sheriff's Office was reached around midday. It was a small one-story facility with a flagpole in front. Ironically, it was rather near to Camille's old primary school. She recognized the neighborhood, though it had altered over the years. Inside, they spoke to a duty sergeant named Jim Warner, who listened closely to Camille's account. The entire time, Camille observed his countenance moving from interest to fear as she mentioned Lawson's name. "Officer Lawson," Warner remarked, leaning back in his chair. He was a heavy-set man, hair thinning, with a placid manner. "He's just been with us a few years. He transferred from a different county. We've had a few issues expressed regarding his actions, but nothing official." Camille shared a gaze with her father. "I'd like to make it official," she remarked. Warner nodded, understanding. "Let's get this complaint on record." Camille made a comprehensive written statement while her father observed, tension lining his cheeks. She detailed everything from Lawson's bullying techniques to the humiliating way he threw her license and registration on the ground. Warner typed it up meticulously. "Thank you," Warner remarked once it was done. "We'll initiate an internal investigation. I can't promise results immediately, but it'll be looked into." Camille arose, adjusting the front of her shirt. "I understand. If you need more from me, let me know. I'll be in town for a bit." Her father cleared his throat. "Let's just hope this is the last time we have to do something like this." Warner stood as well and offered a tiny, compassionate grin. "I'm sorry you had to go through this, genuinely. We have a lot of competent officers here, but sometimes a bad apple slips through." Camille and her father said their goodbyes and went. Outside in the afternoon sunshine, Camille felt a bit of weight lifted from her shoulders. She hoped that this might be the last of her encounters with Officer Lawson, that perhaps the humiliating episode had at least contributed to some responsibility, but destiny, or perhaps just the twisted essence of fate, had other intentions. That evening, Camille and her father had a small birthday meal. A few of the family friends came over, old veterans who had served with Robert in the Marines. Camille regaled them with some sanitized stories of her career in military intelligence, omitting sensitive information, of course. As she talked, a sense of pride came to her, overshadowing the dread and wrath from the night before. If nothing else, these men and women understood service and sacrifice. They wouldn't have permitted an ounce of disrespect for one of their own. The next morning, Camille awakened early. Despite the coziness of her father's home, she felt restless. She decided to go for a run through her old neighborhood. The cold North Carolina air rejuvenated her. As her feet pounded the pavement, she thought through her next steps in handling the misbehavior complaint. She also mused about her imminent reassignment to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where she'd be working on a special intelligence project. She was buried in thought when she heard a pair of sirens in the distance. Normally, she would disregard them as ordinary traffic enforcement, but when she turned a corner, she observed a disturbance near a store. A few people had gathered, staring at something happening in the parking lot. Camille jogged closer. Curiosity piqued. She saw a patrol car in the lot, its lights flashing, and recognized the tall figure standing by the driver's door. It was Officer Lawson. A surge of chilly tension flashed through her. He was ranting at someone, a middle-aged black man in a tattered mechanic's uniform. The man stood with his arms outstretched, apparently afraid. Camille spotted a second officer, a younger man near the squad car, appearing plainly uncomfortable with Lawson's manner. Camille lowered her pace to a stroll and approached cautiously. Bystanders murmured among themselves, some putting out smartphones to record. It seems Lawson had stopped the man for a minor traffic issue, but suddenly it was escalating. "You think you can speak off to me?" Lawson spat, pointing violently. "Let's see how tough you are when I lock you up." The man, transfixed by Lawson's look, stammered. I was just—" "Shut up," Lawson snapped, forcing the man into the bonnet of the cop car. A sensation of déjà vu and indignation overwhelmed Camille. She pushed forward, dismissing the small voice in her head that urged caution. She had handled considerably greater threats than a hot-headed cop. "Officer Lawson," she called in a stern voice, "let him go." Lawson's head jerked up, his eyes sharpening with recognition. He gazed at Camille. "You again," he muttered, a sneer curving his mouth. By now the other officer glanced between Lawson and Camille, bewilderment registering on his face. The onlookers roused, their cameras directed at the tension unfolding. Lawson's nostrils flared. "Stay out of this," he yelled at Camille. "You have no authority here." Camille didn't back down. "I know who you are, officer, and I've seen how you treat people." "You're traveling down the same route you attempted with me," Lawson gave out a hollow laugh. "You think you can show up and yell orders? I don't care if you claim to be some big-shot soldier. You're on my turf." The man in the mechanic's uniform moved his head slightly, relief pouring over his features as he realized someone was interfering. Upon observing the change, Lawson pushed him more forcefully against the police vehicle. Hands clenched by Camille. "Listen up, officer. You're on camera. Get rid of the guy." The audience caught Lawson's attention. Uncertainty flickered across his features for an instant. Then he tried to cover it up with an air of superiority. All Lawson could say was that he was fighting for his freedom. A younger police officer took the lead. "Indeed, sir," he murmured, with an air of uncertainty. "All he did was inquire as to the reason for his detention. That's not being resistant." Lawson glared at the policeman with anger. "What are you trying to tell me about my job?" On this occasion, Camille wasted no time. "Just take a step back and try to de-escalate. This may end immediately." A look of bewilderment flashed across Lawson's face. Everything had gotten out of hand, and his standard method of intimidating wasn't working, especially with Camille and the cameras around. He loosened his grip on the mechanic's arm after a nervous moment. "Even though he growled at you, it doesn't absolve you of responsibility." Swiftly, Camille rushed up to the man's side and steadied him. "Are you okay?" whispered the question. With grateful eyes, he nodded nervously. Lawson looked across at the younger cop, his voice strained with annoyance as he demanded that he be penalized for the driving infraction. Lawson could see the rage in Camille's eyes as she gazed at her. Speaking softly, she informed him that someone from Internal Affairs would be speaking with him. It was clear he was furious. "Is it so?" She was unfazed. "Yeah, I see." Lawson appeared to be attempting to collect himself, fixing his belt and stance as the spectators persisted in recording. Acknowledging the onlookers, he parted the gathering. "Leave this place immediately," he said. A mixture of relief and rekindled wrath washed over Camille, mirroring her feelings from the previous night. It was inappropriate for this individual to be wearing a badge. She questioned whether her formal report would prompt action swift enough to prevent him from inflicting major harm on someone. The mechanic man murmured a soft thank you as she departed. "Yes," Camille said with a nod. She was not looking for compliments. She merely desired responsibility. She was capable of seeing it through, and her determination grew stronger. Videos of the fight started making the rounds on social media within a few hours. From several angles, though fleetingly, Camille's face could be seen. Most notably, the video caught Lawson getting violent, which led to him punching and kicking the mechanic. Something about this episode struck a chord with the community, even though videos of officers stepping out of line were not new. Protesters in the area took it up and called for Lawson's dismissal. A public uproar ensued as accounts of Lawson's violent behavior circulated. Surprisingly, Camille became a public figure. She was ready to fight this war incognito, but it was quickly going viral on local and international media. Lawson was watched very closely in the days that followed. As a result of public demand, the sheriff's office opened an official investigation. Lawson became enraged by the increasing criticism and placed all the responsibility on Camille. He thought things would have continued as usual if she hadn't gotten involved. While her father encouraged Camille to consult a civil rights attorney, Camille chose to go it alone. She also reached out to the Internal Affairs branch of the department. The question, however, lingered in her thoughts. Would Lawson do anything to ensure his safety? After spending the day with her attorney, Camille returned to her father's house by herself as the sun was setting. For the evening, Robert went to see a buddy. As she entered the driveway, the sky turned from a kaleidoscope of pinks and oranges to a deep purple. Her phone buzzed as she searched her purse for the house keys. "If you know what's good for you, leave town," read the text message sent by an unknown phone. Camille's heart rate increased. She was no stranger to danger, especially from enemies abroad. But getting one in her hometown's backyard unsettled her. Her breathing became more steady. Is Lawson a possibility? Alternatively, someone connected to him? She swiftly took a screenshot of the message and saved the number to her mental dossier. She entered the house, turned on a couple of lights, and double-checked every lock. In the stillness of the interior, she experienced an unnerving feeling of exposure. In the midst of an increasingly heated argument, she returned home to celebrate her father's birthday. With her phone in her hand, she took a seat at the kitchen table and began to compose a message to her father. "My phone just rang, and it was a menacing message, Dad. Telling you the truth, I'm okay. When you're almost back, please let me know." She considered contacting law enforcement. However, her faith in the local police was eroded by Lawson's actions. Sergeant Warner, the duty sergeant she had encountered at the station, was instead the one she contacted. This person appeared to be empathetic. In her voicemail, she described the threat in detail. Lawson or someone close to him might be attempting to frighten her according to her gut. If such is the case, then the appearance of increasingly serious dangers was inevitable. She was still hardly a defenseless bystander, though. Even though she was on leave, her abilities were perfected for handling hazardous situations. Subtly, Camille went to her SUV, got out one of her duffel bags and brought it inside. Personal protection equipment was on her person, but she would need to be aware of the laws in her area. Additionally, she was seen frequently with a small, lawfully owned sidearm. Steadfastly, she retreated to her former bedroom, where she had stashed the pistol case for quick access. Because her father's house was on the smaller side and had just a few entrances and exits, she made a quick round of the house to make sure everything was secure. A sense of unease subsided as she patiently awaited her turn. Time went by. It was excruciatingly slow, yet the wall clock kept ticking. Near midnight, she suddenly heard the sound of an automobile outside. She stood up straight, her body rigid and her pulse racing. It was expected that her father would not return for another hour. Hidden behind the blinds, she sneaked up to the window and peered through. Headlights turned off, a shadowy car idling across the street. No driver could be discerned by her. After what seemed like an eternity, the car finally drove away, leaving behind the specter. Camille attempted to take a picture of the license plate using the camera on her phone, but the lighting was inadequate. Once again, her phone beeped. An unknown number sends another text message. "You don't look quite as tough without your uniform, do you?" Inside her, a tangle of terror and wrath formed. In response, she typed, "Who is this?" It went unanswered, though. Intimidation was a strategy she was familiar with. She had personally employed them in foreign settings to arouse possible dangers or induce them to err. Only now she was the one being hunted. She finally told her father the truth when he came back. He lost his cool. Without uttering a word, Camille nodded. According to her, we should ask Sergeant Warner. After what seemed like 20 taking note of the texts, he looked over Camille's phone. The car across the street was mentioned by her to him. Warner stated that a drive-by patrol may be conducted. "I will remember to write down the number. Things get trickier if it's a burner phone, but we'll figure it out." Robert saw Warner's countenance. "Think Lawson can pull this off?" Warner let out a sigh as his shoulders drooped. "Though I can't be sure, I do know that he is furious." He was the subject of a more thorough inquiry by the relevant agencies. Either he's scared or someone else is on his side. A low growl was emitted by Robert Turner. "We want protection," he proclaimed. "This nation justifiably deserves it after all my daughter has done." Nodding, Warner acknowledged. "My commander will receive the message from me. Take caution, though. You should contact us right away if you see anything out of the ordinary." Camille and her father sat in the living room after Warner had left. The deep shadows created by the antique lamp on the walls, they were burdened by the gravity of the situation. "I will not run," Camille whispered. "Regardless of their actions." Robert reached out to touch her shoulder. "Yeah, that's a no. We persist in our stance." A wave of comfort washed over Camille despite the anxiety. It wasn't just her. With her father's support and her unyielding determination, she was determined to see this through. Contrary to expectations, news of the incident at the convenience shop had spread beyond the immediate area. The story was picked up by a major network, which highlighted the outcry from the local community and Camille's decision to step in. Although her rank and unit were not immediately disclosed, rumors began to circulate that she was a senior Army officer who had bravely intervened after being harassed by a police officer and had subsequently protected another victim. The impending storm made Lawson's demise look inevitable. But animals that are cornered often fight back the strongest, and Lawson was determined not to give up without a fierce and bloody battle. Hot under the collar was Officer Derek Lawson. He had seen the online footage of himself being scolded. While an investigation was underway, his own agency put him on administrative leave. The judgment and scrutiny of others seemed to follow him around. Lawson read text messages from friends and acquaintances who still felt sorry for him as he moved frantically around his home in a disorganized living room with partially closed curtains. Even among those who were just as racist, a small number privately backed him, but no one dared to publicly defend him. With their son in tow, Lawson's wife had departed for her sister's residence. The accusations made her feel ashamed, and the last thing she wanted was for the media to pursue them. In the face of these consequences, Lawson, engulfed in wrath, discovered neither comfort nor logic. On the contrary, he pointed the finger at Camille Turner. His thoughts spiraled out of control, and he began to believe that she was behind his career's downfall and his public shame. Standing motionless on the wayside, she had defied his authority, he recalled. She had stepped in at the convenience store, he remembered. Lawson once sent a string of menacing texts while glued to his phone after having a couple too many drinks. The thought of frightening her into submission gave him a renewed sense of strength. Ignoring the fact that his actions were effectively further implicating him, he hit send. New allegations of Lawson's wrongdoing surfaced daily. Victims of prejudice, intimidation, and dubious searches came forward to share their stories. An internal probe was expedited by the local agency. If some of the claims turned out to be true, there was even discussion of possible criminal prosecution. A union representative encouraged Lawson to remain silent and allow the investigation to unfold when he contacted them in a state of desperation. But he couldn't find relief from Lawson's wrath. Until he devised a cunning scheme, he was fixated on Camille, or that conceited soldier as he referred to her. Only one card remained for him to play. He had heard whispers that Camille had returned from a possible classified overseas posting. Even though he was clueless about the inner workings of military intelligence, he foolishly thought that he might deflect scrutiny from himself by uncovering some damning evidence. Lawson attempted to learn more about Camille, using some dubious means. He found out that she was to be sent to Fort Bragg, North Carolina shortly, her rank and the address of her father. Additionally, he learned that she possessed top-secret clearance. According to Lawson, that could indicate that she was keeping something from her. She might be portrayed as a danger to the nation's security, perhaps. Perhaps he could raise questions about her validity. He could cast doubt on her credibility and divert attention away from the internal affairs probe if he could just muddle the waters. He persisted in trying nevertheless, even though Lawson lacked the brains and means to really damage her military career. He tried to scare her into thinking something embarrassing may happen by texting her from a burner phone and bringing up her intelligence background. Lawson became more aggressive when Camille showed no fear. An ultimate breakdown on his part was practically unavoidable. Standing in her father's living room, reading a forwarded email, Camille eventually found herself there a few days later. The sender claimed to have proof that Camille had broken national security standards, but the address was unknown. In the event that she did not withdraw her complaint against Officer Lawson, the email threatened to disclose embarrassing information. Camille saw through the strategy, an insincere effort at coercion. It was obvious to her that any proof would be fabricated or unimportant. Still, a mix of horror and loathing made her gut turn. After showing her father the email, she contacted her lawyer. They were in agreement to have it forwarded to the Army command. Once Camille described the circumstances, her supervisors would definitely see through the deception. But the mystery persisted. How could Lawson have possibly acquired any verifiable details regarding her deployment? She had her suspicions that he might have departmental links with database access for the police. She was determined not to be intimidated. Camille was supposed to meet with the chief of police and an investigator from internal affairs later that afternoon to discuss her official complaint. As she steadily made her way through the station's doors, she arrived. Anxieties permeated the structure. There was a palpable feeling of a tempest brewing as officers hurried around. Phones rang non-stop. In a cramped conference room, she was met by Chief Roland Foster, a towering, graying man with a severe countenance. Sitting next to him, perusing a file, was Detective Alicia Monroe, a lady from the Internal Affairs Department. Alicia Turner, Chief Roland Foster stated, "Your time is greatly appreciated." "Take a seat, please." Camille sat down at a little table. The solemn mood and drawn blinds caught her attention. As a first step, Monroe coughed, "the footage and various concerns have been reviewed by us. Your father's statement and your own are also in our possession." Took a quick look at Camille. "It's captivating, to put it mildly." "Understood, G. Foster." Officer Lawson should be suspended immediately pending final disciplinary action, which might include termination, according to Internal Affairs. Camille had a surge of relief. "Much obliged. If this stops additional damage, then I will be grateful. Warnings have already been delivered to me by Officer Lawson. My father and I are worried about our safety." A pout formed on Monroe's face. "We are cognizant of that. On top of a judge's restraining order, local officials are keeping a close eye on the situation. You should keep Lawson away from you. He could face arrest if he gets in touch with you again." Exhaling, Foster let out a sound. "He was also utilizing police resources to gather intelligence on you, which we discovered. That's a major security hole. Nobody will treat it lightly." Simultaneously, Camille clasped her hands on the table. "It makes sense to me. I appreciate you telling me, but you should be aware that he will not leave quietly. He believes I have information regarding my military service that could incriminate him, and he has threatened to reveal it. It may bring about mayhem, even if it is completely absurd." Monroe's face became more angular. "Every effort will be made. Would you like to remain in town or work with Army security?" Camille thought about it. "I don't need to involve my CO just yet. I'm capable of handling things on my own. I simply do not want my father to be injured in any kind of ambush." Foster stood up after giving a nod, signaling that the meeting had concluded. "Updates will be provided to you. At the same time, please contact us right away if you see or hear anything about him. As we await the hearing, we will ensure that he is disarmed and sent on leave." With a sense of relief that justice was being partially advanced, Camille thanked them and departed. But something was still off. With a stride across the station lobby, she emerged into the warm light of the late afternoon sun. As Camille stepped out of the police station, the sky above was a kaleidoscope of pinks and oranges. While driving home, she let the warm air of North Carolina wash over her by partially opening the windows. Something seemed off to her when she pulled into her dad's driveway. There was an open entrance at the front. Her senses were heightened instantly. She parked the SUV, got out in a whisper, and cautiously made her way to the door. She whispered to her father as she stepped inside. From the living room, a crash resounded. Throat was pounding. Returning to the outdoors, she quickly made her way to her SUV, where she retrieved her sidearm from the secured container. As if her training had taken effect, she stooped low and crept back into the home. There was no illumination in the living room. Rummaging was audible to her when she detected a rustle in the kitchen. Her father's voice, somewhat muted, then reached her ears. Camille's heart raced. Around the bend, she stole a quick look. Her father, arms lifted, was discernible in the low light. Lawson stood across from him, gasping for air. Despite being just partially dressed, his expression betrayed his desperation. He appeared to be a man on the brink. "Is it your intention to ruin my life?" Lawson, who had not yet noticed Camille, let out a hiss. "I was embarrassed by your daughter. She's actively working to have me fired." "Destroyed all." In a composed manner, Robert Turner raised his hands. "Wow, this isn't how it's done, officer." With her weapon drawn and aimed low, Camille stealthily maneuvered around the doorway. She was afraid she may frighten him into opening fire. As it scampered across the floor, a chair was kicked by Lawson. "Have you heard that I've been suspended? They have accused me of being racist. I know my wife's departure and the subsequent damage to my reputation are both her fault." Robert did his best to maintain a low voice. "Here we are, ready to discuss this. Please set down whatever it is you're holding and—" Lawson's voice quivered. "Put your daughter away. This was initiated by her." Camille breathed out. She noticed that Lawson was holding a pistol. "This gun is for personal use only. It is not his official armament." Her pulse raced. She advanced with her weapon drawn. According to her, Officer Lawson, her voice resounded in the quiet room. "Raise your weapon." Lawson whirled around, her gaze untamed. A brief expression of familiarity crossed his face as he caught sight of Camille. At that point, he lost control of his irritation. He reached down and aimed his gun at her father's neck. "Nada!" Camille yelled out as her heart raced. Derek Lawson yelled out as she pressed the barrel against Robert's temple, demanding that he lower his. "Alternately, I shoot." Staying calm is essential while negotiating with someone who is cornered and unstable, according to Camille's training. A constant tone was her forced vocalization. She lied and said, "I'm lowering it," as she slid the muzzle down a little while maintaining her finger on the trigger guard. If she didn't have any other option, she wouldn't entirely abandon it. With labored breaths, Robert met Camille's gaze. In her quiet assurance, she hoped he would put his trust in her. Then Derek Lawson snarled and threw it or kicked it aside. Camille was unsure. Everything would be possible for Derek Lawson if she completely gave up her pistol. The fate of her father, though, was precariously balanced. Time seemed to pause. The tense quiver of Derek Lawson's finger and the bead of sweat streaming down his temple were visible to her. She imagined the kitchen's arrangement down to the slant of the counters and the placement of the chairs. In her head, she quickly calculated. Now, Derek Lawson let out a roar. Gradually bending over, Camille set her gun down on the floor. With unwavering focus on Derek Lawson, she slid it aside with her foot. Derek Lawson nodded to himself and let out a nervous breath. His grip on Robert's revolver tightened as he retreated. Whispering under his breath, madness glinted in his eyes as he considered murdering you both. They'll claim you attacked me in self-defense. Robert attempted to put some distance between himself and the barrel at that very second by abruptly shifting to the side. To maintain his target, Derek Lawson jerked the rifle. For Camille, that was the beginning. With a U-turn around Derek Lawson's extended arm, she sprang forward. As a well-rehearsed disarm technique, her left hand sprang out and hit the inside of his wrist. The trigger of his firearm was grasped by her right hand. A thunderous boom echoed through the atmosphere. The projectile lodged in the subfloor. Camille squeezed Derek Lawson's arm, and his eyes widened. He let go of the sword due to the agony. She knocked him out cold by slamming her elbow into his chest. Robert sprang to avoid it, but he stumbled and fell against a chair. Derek Lawson attempted to get to his feet while gasping for air. After knocking the gun on the ground, Camille tackled Derek Lawson. Without resorting to deadly force, she pinned him with her knee on his back. "Stay down," she said. As he fought and mumbled obscenities, Camille pressed her knee even harder. In a flash, she grabbed 2 zip ties from a drawer, an antique her father had stashed away, and fastened them around Derek Lawson's wrists. Her chest tightened as she wiped him clean, seeking to eliminate any last weaponry. Robert regained his composure and staggered along. He contacted Camille, his voice quivering. With a look of relief on her face, she gazed to her father. He seemed unscathed, but visibly frightened. "Dad!" I'm fine. The floor resounded with the rasp of Derek Lawson's respiration. Yes, he gasped for air. You're the one to blame. Disregarding him, Camille took out her phone to dial the station. She offered to send help and provided the address. An armed officer, Derek Lawson, has arrived. I am holding him down. Finally, she hung up. Her eyes briefly shifted to her dad. As the realization of how near it had been set in, her hands quivered slightly, and the adrenaline continued to flow. Robert got to his feet and gingerly made his way past the broken chair. Caressing Camille's shoulder, he extended a hand. Little did he say that you had saved his life, Camille choked on her tongue. Thanks be to God I arrived just in time. Accusing Camille of betraying him and continuing to rant about conspiracies, Derek Lawson proceeded to hurl hate words. The urgency in his voice made him sound desperate. Distant sirens sounded their alarm. Both Camille and her father nodded wearily as they met each other's gaze. The worst of it was almost over. What followed was a haze of an hour or two. Several police vehicles pulled up, sirens blaring. As soon as the police arrived, they drew their weapons and saw Derek Lawson chained and kneeling on Camille's back. As she gently rose up and explained the issue to the responding officers, she raised her hands in protest. With solemn looks on their faces, Sergeant Warner and Detective Monroe came and assessed the scene. Warner gave the order for the police to arrest Derek Lawson. A paramedic examined his injuries as Monroe recorded Camille's statement. Residents gathered outdoors, their expressions betraying their level of amazement as they spoke in whispers. Derek Lawson's breakdown was final, and the consequences were immediate. Breaking and entering, armed criminal, and attempted murder were the charges against him. Tale after tale was covered by the media. Disgraced officer arrested during hostage standoff took place as the storyline changed from officer under investigation. The public learned that Camille was a decorated military intelligence officer. Protests about racial profiling and police accountability ensued after Derek Lawson's arrest, which briefly swept the nation. As a result, Camille began receiving calls from reporters interested in speaking with the decorated military intelligence officer who had defeated a renegade police officer. Instead of praising her individual bravery, she gave a handful of interviews in which she stressed the need of structural changes. Even her father took to community forums to make his point. This wasn't just an isolated incident. There was a systemic problem that required fixing. Many of Derek Lawson's neighbors felt bad that they didn't report her conduct sooner. A sobering reminder that the fight for equal treatment was far from done. Some recognized similarities to instances across the nation. The local community's unfaltering support, from blacks to whites and beyond, provided Camille with a feeling of closure rather than the attention she received from the media. Many came to her father's house to express their gratitude, present food, and offer their sincere apologies for what had happened. Camille found out that several of them had felt helpless when confronted with Derek Lawson's aggressiveness. Her deeds had given them the confidence to think that anything was possible. Camille got ready to leave for Fort Bragg, North Carolina, a few weeks down the road. Standing beside her father's black SUV, which had previously prompted Derek Lawson's concern, she was in her father's driveway. In the glove compartment, she had her orders nicely folded and her belongings stuffed inside. As she loaded the final bag, Robert stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed. "Are you certain you can handle jumping into a new project without any rest?" Concern evident in his voice, he inquired. Camille nodded with determination. "I will be all right, Dad. My spirit longs to resume its slumber. Further, you are familiar with who I am. My attention span is short." With a smile on his face, he moved closer to give her a comforting embrace. "Please assure me that you will not look down on anyone. Well, to a certain extent. Your career will remain unaffected by this." She drew back, locking eyes with him. "Not only will I not do it, but I will also not remain silent when I witness wrongdoing. Silence benefits only those like Derek Lawson, I learned from this." A look of pride filled Robert's eyes as he nodded. I love that gal." Camille got behind the wheel after they shouted their farewells. She looked back at the home as the engine hummed. In her heart she felt a mixture of relief and grief. She was thankful for the opportunity to go on, even though she will miss her father. Just as she sped off, the sun was about to rise over the horizon. Feeling the warmth on her face, Camille recalled a sentence from her training days. "Bravery is being the only one who knows you're afraid." Along with the confidence that came from knowing she had defended those she cared about, she carried that with her. The journey had been filled with both victory and anxiety. Even though she had vowed to defend her home from injustice, she had to face it there and come out stronger. The karmic scales had finally turned, and it was a shocking turn of events in a world where justice was frequently delayed. "I appreciate you coming along on this wild ride with me." We saw Lieutenant Colonel Camille Turner confront the very power that she had previously trusted to save her and her community, not abroad but in our own country, putting her bravery to the test. Officer Derek Lawson's actual character was revealed by her resiliency, and yes, her exceptional military training, which ultimately served as a barrier that averted disaster. The anecdote serves as a reminder that bravery isn't limited to times of intense conflict. On occasion, our very own street becomes the battleground. Those who do the right thing, even when it's hard, often end up becoming the heroes. Please continue this discussion if Camille's experience moved, inspired, or offended you. In order to keep bringing attention to injustice, sharing stories of bravery, and inspiring the change we wish to see in the world, we kindly ask that you like, share, and subscribe. Much obliged for your time.